Hello everyone, welcome back. This is Avorion episode 71. I'm Enigmius, and today we're continuing with the Catapult Battleship build. This video in particular has been a long time in the making for a variety of reasons, but we're forging ahead. And one thing you might notice, if you remember back to the last episode, that large flat surface on the left-hand side of the ship, based on how we're looking at it now, wasn't there. And I had footage of creating that particular spot, but then I decided that I wasn't going to be keeping it. And I kind of made the decision that for something that I know even before the video is made is not going to be staying as part of the build, there's not much point spending a lot of time looking at how it was done. So what we're going to be doing is focusing on the other things that we did prior to removing that section, and then we'll show you what we end up putting in its place. And I think hopefully that will be a slightly more productive use of everyone's time to kind of get a feel for what's actually going to be currently planned as a permanent part of the ship. And this area that we're working on now, we've got kind of a long profile that we've extended from the underside of the ship below that large flat section towards the rear of the ship. And this is kind of an important profile because it's so large and it spans such a long portion of the ship that if it's not right, it's going to be something that you see every single time you look at the ship. And you don't necessarily want to be in a position where you've got this one part that didn't work out the way that you wanted it to, and it's so prominent, it's such a major feature of the design that you can't avoid looking at it. So it was worth taking a little bit of extra time to make sure that that particular section went in the way that I wanted it to. So it's curved. It's a compound curve on a single dimension. It's basically or two-dimensional plane. It kind of curves in one direction and then it curves back the other direction and kind of works its way to the top. And the whole idea is that if you remember back to the Catapult carrier, we had that empty section in the middle of the hull. We're going to be doing the same thing with this ship. It's going to be slightly different dimensions. It's going to be presented a little bit differently. We were thinking in terms of with the catapult and the carrier of having that empty section mostly for just the visual interest, seeing something different. You don't necessarily expect that a ship, especially a warship, is going to have this big empty area, but it did, and I really like the way that it worked out. For a battleship, it's still something that we can do for the aesthetic, having that sort of cavity in the middle of the ship, but we also have to give a little bit of thought to how it impacts the look of the ship when you're thinking of it in terms of a battleship, like a frontline sort of combat vessel. You kind of makes sense that we would give a little bit of thought to making sure that it doesn't end up making the thing look flimsy. Now, we're still working on this particular part of the ship, trying to make it flat from the edge of that profile that we just put in to the existing part of the ship. And the difficulty, as is being the case in a number of circumstances, is that we're overlapping existing blocks, and it doesn't always want to allow us to overlap as much as we need in order to be able to cover things the way that we would like to cover them. Part of that was the way that I designed it and put it into place. I could have probably made things a lot easier on myself if I had known that this was going to be what we were doing. It's one of those things where I have the general idea in my head of where I'm going, but I don't exactly have anything drawn out beside me that I'm using as a guide. It's just kind of getting from my head into the game, and not always in a way that's sort of the best. If we had a little bit of extra time, or if we gave ourselves a little bit of extra time to plan and think about how one decision would affect the other. So we're having to make some adjustments on the fly in order to get this whole thing to come together. And one of those adjustments in this case, as you can see, is instead of just the curve, that profile extending from the front to the back and moving up, we're actually pushing it back towards the hull. We're giving it a third dimension on this thing, so it's going to be more of a ridge, a raised section along this ridge, and then behind that will be the flat section of the hull. And this allows me to tuck things in behind what we've got in place already and create that sort of flat thing without the game saying you can't overlap those blocks because you've got too much between one and the other, and it's no good. So we've got a little bit of extra time invested in getting this whole thing to come together. But as you can see, we still have that initial profile that we spent the time to create and tweak and adjust and get the way that we wanted. The only difference is we've added an extra layer, an extra dimension to the process so that we could get everything to fit the way that we wanted it to. And one of the keys that I'm keeping an eye on with this build, as I did with the Catapult, is the block count, and not allowing the block count to get out of control to the extent where it's affecting the performance of the game. Because we want these ships operating in a fleet, we have to consider not just how each individual ship impacts the performance of the game, but how a fleet of these ships would impact the performance. And I'm not talking about dozens of ships in the fleet. We're talking about 8 to 12 maximum, and each of the ships would have sort of a designated purpose. And the purpose is not to just field as many ships as possible to overwhelm the opposition. It's to have a rounded sort of repertoire and things that the ships are capable of providing, and hopefully with enough thought given to the performance aspects so that we can have all those ships in the same sector operating without tanking the frame rate and causing the game to misbehave, which is kind of the unfortunate thing. Is that it's a balancing act, and by the time you realize that you've gone too far, it's too late already. You're already in a position where you can't go any further. That's sort of the difficult part of the whole thing, is realizing you've pushed it as far as it'll go, and you just can't add any more. You have to start modifying, you have to start scaling back, and you have to start, usually, depending on how far you still had to go before you can say everything was complete, some of that can be pretty demoralizing in the sense that by the time you've got everything scaled back to the point where it works, it's just a shadow of what it was, and it's kind of difficult to move forward. I encountered that in other games with builds that I was doing that were fairly large, fairly technical, and just getting them to the point where they were supposed to be and testing them and realizing that the game wasn't going to support what they were doing, and also realizing that you were past the point of no return. There was no way to go back and make things work and still feel good about the project. So there's definitely more thought going into the block count for these ships in this particular series of builds than previous ships, just because we've learned firsthand, especially with our station, how going overboard with the block count just because we can have a pretty significant impact on the way that the game performs. So here you can see the forward section of the ship that I decided to use in place of that flat section that we had at the very beginning of the video. So the front end of this ship, instead of being fairly compressed side to side, is getting more width. And I liked that idea, especially for a battleship, again, talking about a frontline sort of combat vessel, that we have that big, bulky sort of front end that looks not just like it would be an exceptional ram, but also like it could ram a few times and take a hell of a lot of fire before it starts to show significant signs of damage. That's kind of the long-term goal of this whole thing, and getting it to that point is turning out to be a little bit tricky. And because of this specific area here on the back side of this part of the ship, where we've already extended it outwards, and now we have to take that basic profile that we created in the process of extending it outwards and make it all come together again so that it looks like one solid design. And right about now, at this point that you're looking at here, is where I was in the just throw shapes at it and see if any of it is any good. And that happens a lot. There's nothing wrong with that. For me anyways, as long as I'm realistic about the outcome. It's not so much that I'm taking a sort of haphazard approach to putting things together. It's that I'm not willing to compromise on the end result if I look at it and say there's just not even close to what I had in mind. That's the balancing act for me. It takes a little bit longer, I think, sometimes to do it this way. Other times it saves a lot of time because you find a solution that you never would have come up with if you had sat down and tried to meticulously plan it. 6 of one, half dozen of the other. It'll be different for each person who's trying to do the same thing in the same space. But in this case, what I'm looking at is basically trying to create a finished profile that fits within the larger side profile that we now have. So that's sort of one of the keys, is I don't want it to extend beyond. If you're looking at it from the side, I don't want this particular extruded portion to extend outside the bounds of the larger side profile. That hopefully makes a certain amount of sense. But realistically speaking, what it involves is just sort of figuring out the best way to assemble everything so that I can create all the profiles in all the right places so that it stays within the boundaries that I've set, at least in my head, and have everything come together in a way that I'm happy with. So what ends up happening is, you can see it's not too difficult here on the underside to kind of bring everything together. We'll end up having to make a few changes to this area as well. It's taking a lot less time than it used to. When I was first getting used to the Avorion build system, there was a lot to learn in terms of how things would line up and how important it is to make sure that parts of the same structural element line up across all of the different axes, because if they don't, when you have one section meet up with another section in the middle and they don't line up, that's where you get the seams that you didn't want. So it's important to kind of keep an eye on that. In this case, I wasn't successful necessarily in keeping a close eye on it, but we're getting closer with each iteration to what I want. So you can see we've got basically the top half is more or less done. We could say it's done in the sense that there's a structural component there. We've got maybe half of the underside is done, and now we have to do this section in the bottom right quarter, I guess you could say, finishing it all off, closing it all in, following the profile that we've already established for the side of the ship, and getting it set up in a way that we're happy with the minimum number of compromises in order to make the geometry work. This was kind of the challenging aspect of the process, and I wanted to make sure that I got at least some of this build section into this episode, because at the beginning we were talking about that side piece that was going to be removed, and we knew it was going to be removed, so we're not going to keep it and show you how we built it without showing you at least some of the build process of this section here in this episode. It felt like it would be kind of incomplete. So it's not done yet. There's still work to be done, and we're going to take a look at that work in the next episode and get this section complete. And then we're going to continue on working our way towards the back of the ship with some pretty aggressive profiles and things sticking out in various different places that will hopefully give this that big, bulky, assertive look that we're looking for, wider than the carrier, but still a little bit more maneuverable in the sense that we can turn a little bit faster, we can accelerate a little bit faster, we can get ourselves into situations and hopefully, if necessary, back out. Not necessarily in a way that you would look at it and say nimble, but better than the carrier that we have now. So there's that consideration, and we're giving ourselves plenty of room to install all of the equipment we need in order to make that happen. So next episode, we're going to carry on, like I said. We're going to be building from this part here. We're going to finish off this section and start pushing towards the back end. And then we'll see how it goes. We've still got other ships to build in this series. It is taking quite a bit longer between episodes currently. It will continue to be a little bit of a delay between episodes for a little while, but we're going to get back into things eventually. I haven't given up. I'm not unhappy with the game. I haven't decided that I don't want to play it anymore. Things are just taking a little while. So I appreciate your patience, and I appreciate you sticking with it and taking a look at what we've got, even if it's quite a long time between updates. So if you want to be notified, if you're just coming across this and you have no idea what I'm talking about, but you want to be notified when we add the next episode, the easiest way to do that is to subscribe to my channel. You can also follow me on Twitter, being the only social media that I really use, but I post updates on when videos are uploaded there as well. And those are the options, so you can be notified. If you want to leave comments, feedback, you can do that below. Thanks for watching, guys, and take care.